Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture regarding progressivism and reform. Now, when we left off, we were talking about these big changes that went on during the turn of the 20th century, including this push for empire known as imperialism. We have a reform movement called progressivism, and both of these movements are being pushed forward by new forms of journalism. And it was this new form of journalism that really began to spur Mexican-American activism, as we highlighted with Jovita Idar. Now, despite all these changes that would occur, and again, there are numerous changes that we could go into, and I could spend a couple of lectures just talking about progressive reforms. But despite all these changes of the progressive era, Mexicanos, unlike their Anglo counterparts, often found deaf ears when they complained about issues they were facing during the first couple decades of the 20th century, the so-called progressive era. Take strikes, for instance. When Theodore Roosevelt, president, interceded in the 1902 coal strike, seemingly showing a willingness of the federal government to intervene on behalf of workers. But there were also other strikes that he would not get involved in. And so while we are guilty teaching U.S. history, often of highlighting how much of importance Teddy Roosevelt was, highlighting the coal strike, in other strikes, things didn't go so well. So this is not a full solution here. So again, let's look at the 1903 Oxnard beat strike. So one of the ways employers were able to kind of keep their workers from striking was to pit them almost racially against one another. This was often done, especially in the North, between whites and blacks, or old stock U.S. citizens versus new immigrants who spoke a different language. Because the one big fear in U.S. history, in quite honestly global history, was that poor people, the working class, would realize that despite their ethno-racial linguistic differences, they had more alike or more in common than they did differences. And if they ever realized that and forged an interracial, interethnic alliance, they would be more powerful and overturn the social, economic, cultural order. And so Anglos in the United States specifically would try to always enforce that black-white binary. That you are either white or you are black. And even if you are a poor white person, well, take solace in the fact that you are not black. You're still better than black people. And this has been reinforced throughout U.S. history, this idea of white supremacy. But it was always based on the presupposition of a black-white binary. The problem for many Anglo-Americans was that there are certain groups like Mexicanos that seem to fall in between. They would try to pit them as black or see them as black or treat them as black, but legally they were white. So they were, as we said earlier, off-white. And this fear of an interracial, interethnic coalition will epitomize and coalesce in 1903 in Oxnard, California at a sugar beet strike. So here's what happens. In January of 1903, the beet workers, the workers in the field, will form a union known as the JMLA, the Japanese Mexican Labor Association. This is formed in January 1903. On February 11th, 1903, 500 Japanese and 200 Mexican laborers, again, Mexicanos, who constituted the JMLA, begin to complain to the Western Agricultural Contracting Company, so the WACC. So the WACC was this essentially hiring committee that they were a job bank where they would hire workers to work in the fields of these large agribusiness growers in California. They're called the Western Agricultural Contracting Company. They would contract workers. And so this union forms in January, the JMLA. And on February 11th, 500 Japanese and 200 Mexican laborers come together and they begin to complain to the WACC, accusing them of paying less than they were promised. They also oppose the subcontracting system. So what's happening here is they're having to pay a commission both to the WACC and to the owners for the privilege of working the fields, forcing them to give up more of their wages. They also pushed for the freedom to buy goods wherever they wanted and to avoid the unreasonably high prices of the company store. So that was in February. Well, on March 23rd, 1903, violence broke out. One worker, 21-year-old Mexicano Luis Vasquez, was killed. And 4 others were wounded, 2 of which were Mexicanos, 2 were Japanese. There was going to be an inquest into the death, and they blamed the violence. The local police blamed the violence, the 1 death and 4 wounded, and the shooting on the strikers. So let me repeat this again. On March 23rd, violence breaks out. A 21-year-old Mexicano, Luis Vasquez, is killed, and then 4 others are wounded, 2 Mexicanos, 2 Japanese. When they investigated this violence and the death, it was blamed on the striking workers. Although witness after witness testified that it was an armed Anglo farmer who shot randomly into the crowd. So justice is not served here at all. But after the incident, the company will concede to the union's demands for better pay and the abolition of the unfair subcontracting system. So here we have a victory for a minority group union consisting of a joint coalition of both Mexicanos and Japanese. And again, please note this is 1903. This is prior to the Gentleman's Agreement that ended Japanese immigration. After this victory, though, the secretary of the Mexican branch of the JMLA, his name was Lizaras, he applied for union membership into the largest national union in the United States, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Now, Samuel Gompers, president of the AFL, this was a union that, generally speaking, was not like the Knights of Labor. In fact, it is often taught that the AFL replaced the Knights of Labor. But they really didn't replace them. They just came after them. Because the Knights of Labor was very egalitarian, all about equality, wanting all these high, lofty ideals. They, embraced women and minority groups. They advocated for equal pay. They took both skilled and unskilled labor. The AFL, on the other hand, was more of, it only worked with skilled labor for the most part. And so after this victory in 1903, where the union won against the growers, the secretary of the Mexican branch of the JMLA, his name is Lizaras, he will apply for membership to the AFL, to which the president of the AFL, Samuel Gompers, replies that he would let the Mexican sugar workers join the AFL, provided that the Japanese would not be allowed to participate in the labor union. Remember, this is 1903. We are just a few years away from essentially Japanese exclusion with the Gentleman's Agreement. Anti-Japanese sentiment was running high. And so in a letter to Lizaras, Gompers stated that, quote, the union must guarantee that it will under no circumstances accept membership of any Chinese or Japanese, unquote. Remember, this is the era of Chinese exclusion and soon to be exclusion of Japanese. But notice the response from Lizaras. He responds saying, quote, "We are going to stand by the men who stood by us in the long, hard fight that ended in victory over the enemy," unquote. A couple things at play here. One is playing the races or ethnic groups off each other was a common practice of the owners. Here was a union head doing the exact same thing because of his own racism. And I'm going to give the Mexicanos of the JMLA credit here. Lizaras said, no, we fought side by side with the Japanese to get this victory for the Union. We are not going to abandon them now because of your racist attitudes. Unfortunately, as the JMLA leaders predicted, the Union would not be able to sustain itself without a national coalition or affiliation support of a group like the AFL. And as a result, within 7 years, by 1910, the JMLA ceased to exist. So again, despite being more reform-minded, the racism that still existed would often doom interracial alliances. But I also want you to notice one more thing. Notice the headlines in newspapers on the slide. If you read the headline like I did, read the top headline on your screen right now. Japanese laborers fight with Mexicans. And if you read the article, it says 200 shots were exchanged today in a labor fight between Japanese and Mexicans over a union attempt. 2 Japanese and another Mexican were shot. They're on the verge of a bloody fight connected to the sugar industry. 200 shots are fired and 5 wounded. Nowhere in these articles does it ever talk about Anglos precipitating this violence. The way the articles, especially the headlines read, this looks like it's a war between Japanese and Mexicanos. This is a direct example of how the Anglo press used events like this to racialize and divide potential ethno-racial alliances between working class people. The bottom line headline even insinuates that there were opposing unions, casting all that they were belonging to opposing opposite side unions, casting all unions as being violent. Likewise, let's take a look at the Ludlow Massacre in Trinidad, Colorado. It's a southern Colorado mine at Ludlow Mine in officially Trinidad, Colorado. Ludlow is a unique case study. It's a violent event. Again, this is the progressive era, right? But it continues to stir the imagination because of who was all involved. The people involved in this were literally a who's who of America in this era. They include the Rockefeller family, which actually owned the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, one of the largest coal operators in the West. It included the United Mine Workers of America Union, one of the most powerful unions at the time. It included the Baldwin Phelps and Pinkerton detective agencies. The Pinkerton Detective Agency were a group of former soldiers who were basically, they were a mercenaries for hire. You would pay them to come in and basically beat up strikers, to break strikes, to use violence. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. Legendary labor leader Mother Jones. Colorado Governor Elias Ammons. And even the freaking Texas Rangers are involved. They are going to be imported into Colorado to help guard the coal mines. Now it starts as it always starts. The miners' plight was a fight for fair wages, an 8-hour workday, health and safety regulations, and the right to live where they wanted, not in the overpriced company housing. They wanted to eat where they wanted rather than company-owned restaurants. They wanted to see the doctor of their choice rather than being told you must go to this doctor because, well, he's the cheapest one we could find. And they also wanted the coal operators, coal companies, to recognize collective bargaining of the union's power. So 1913, they go on strike. Hundreds of Hispanos, Mexicanos, Mexicans, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, and many Mexicans who were fleeing the Mexican Revolution are going to go on strike. And the first thing that the company does is evict these strikers from their company-owned homes. So now they have no place to live. They're striking from work. They have no place to live, no money coming in. And so rather than give in, 1,200 miners and their families would pitch tents at Ludlow that are on the plains just east of the Spanish Peaks, just outside of Trinidad, Colorado. So the miners aren't going to give in here. They refuse to give up. And the mines are not able to operate. And so first, the Colorado governor, who the Rockefeller mine owners actually refer to as, quote, our little cowboy governor. So the Colorado governor called out the National Guard, paid for by the Rockefeller family. Now, at first, the miners thought the Guard was being sent to protect them. And they actually greeted the arrival of the National Guard with flags and waving and cheers. But they soon found out that the National Guard was there to destroy the strike. The National Guard brought strikebreakers under the cover of night, not even telling these scab workers and strikebreakers that there was even a strike. The National Guardsmen would beat the miners, arrest them by the hundreds, ride them down with their horses, and parade the women through the streets of Trinidad. And yet the miners still refused to give in. And then it turned to winter. It was cold. And yet the workers stayed true to solidarity. They stayed true to their course of action. And it became clear to the owners and the state that extraordinary measures would be needed to break the strike. So on April of 1914, 2 National Guard companies were stationed in the hills overlooking the largest tent colony of strikers, the one at Ludlow, housing more than 1,000 men, women, and children. On the morning of April 20th, a machine gun attack began on the tents. The miners fired back. Their leader of this tent community of the Union was lured up into the hills under the auspices of negotiating a truce agreement. He was shot to death by a company of National Guardsmen. The women and children in the tents began to dig pits beneath the tents to escape gunfire. So they're literally digging holes in the earth, trenches, inside these tents to protect themselves from gunfire. At dusk, the National Guard moved down from the hills after pelting them with bullets all day. They moved down from the hills with torches, set fire to the tents as families fled into the hills. 13 more people were killed by gunfire. But then it gets worse. The following day, a telephone linesman was going through the ruins of the tent colony at Ludlow. And when he was doing that, he lifted an iron pot that was covering one of these dugout pits in the tents and found the charred, twisted bodies of 11 children and 2 women. This became known as the Ludlow Massacre. The miners would attend the funeral services for the 26 dead at Ludlow. Then they walked from the funeral to a nearby building where guns were stacked up for them. They picked up rifles and went into the hills, destroying the mines, killing the mine guards, and exploding mine shafts. The press reported that, quote, the hills in every direction seemed suddenly alive with men, unquote. The governor of Colorado asked federal troops to restore order, and Woodrow Wilson complied. This accomplished, the strike ended. Congressional committees came in and took thousands of pages of testimony. But in the end, 66 men, women, and children had been killed. The Union had won no recognition. They gained nothing. And yet, not a single militiaman or mine guard or National Guardsman had ever been indicted for a crime. Because I'm sorry, I have a hard time talking about the story. It bothers me. Because it's so tragic to treat human life, poor workers just fighting for survival, to treat them like this. It's heartbreaking. And despite the talk of all this progressivism during this era, where was it for Mexicanos? And as a result of things like the Oxnard strike, as a result of things like Ludlow, Mexicanos were often left feeling they would have to do it alone. There was no help. And this work during the early 1900s often fell to two major groups. The Mexican consuls, those Mexican officials in the United States that are designed to help, usually with citizenship questions and immigration things, but Mexican consuls took on a bigger role here, and also mutual aid societies. Now, Mexican consuls first. Now, in general, consuls from any country are established to aid foreign nationals in being able to go back and forth between nations. They're also usually helpful in help get redress or settle disputes while their nationals are in a foreign nation. So they can provide legal counsel and support. And so the idea of a consul from any country, so let's say from Mexico, the case we're talking about, Mexican consul's primary objective was to ensure that if you were a Mexican living in the United States, you had some legal help in case of an issue. Whether it's to get in and out of the country, whether it's because you're charged with a crime, whatever the reason is, that's their job. And so one of the main roles of the Mexican consulate then is to serve and protect Mexican nationals in the United States. But the Mexican consuls in the early 20th century took on a much more expanded role. Because in the United States, Mexican consuls, they didn't have a lot of full authority. They had, as what one historian called, a lot more bark than bite. They weren't able to help Mexican nationals who found themselves in trouble in the United States. In fact, one historian quotes them as saying, quote, Mexicans often perceive the consul's inability to free jailed compatriots or remedy other kinds of wrongs as inaction or indifference, unquote. And so what they find is these Mexican consuls were often weak at doing their major task at hand, which is helping foreign nationals. But the Mexican consuls were a little different. They would take on a more unique role than other nations' consulates. Yes, they did things like aiding travel and emigration. They did provide legal help. But Mexican consuls were unique in that they played a vital role for both Mexican nationals in the United States and Mexican Americans. What it seemed like, and what has been proven through history, is that Mexican nationals were just as concerned with promoting Mexican nationalism as they were with providing legal services for Mexicans in the area. See, normally their job is to protect foreign nationals. In this case, though, the Mexican consuls were also trying to promote and help Mexican Americans. Expanded role. And one of their primary focuses was actually to instill a sense of Mexican pride or Mexican nationalism in both Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans in the United States. And therefore, a central goal of every program initiated by the Mexican consulate was the preservation and cultural integrity of Mexican immigrants through the establishment of institutions that were designed to bolster Mexican patriotism. Because they had the long-term goal of, okay, all these Mexican people are coming to the United States. They will acquire skills, they will acquire money, they will acquire technology, and then long-term they will come back to Mexico. And when they do, not only will they help Mexico modernize, but they will also still be, quote unquote, Mexican. Because culturally, they'll retain those Mexican patriotism traits thanks to the work of the consulates. Now, one of the biggest examples of this is called the Fiestas Patrias. You see, in Mexico, there's a few national holidays that are uniquely, distinctly Mexican. Most notably, of course, is things like the 16 de Septiembre, celebrating Mexican Independence Day. Now, this holiday has commonly been celebrated by Mexicanos in the United States. Now, we could spend forever here, as there are multiple books on the subjects, including a published article that played an integral role in my dissertation. And we will return to this topic of celebrations in a future lecture. But I want to focus on a narrow view of these celebrations right now, the Fiestas Patrias. And it is that the Mexican government began to utilize these Mexican national holidays, specifically the 16, to promote the Mexican nation state building, cultivating a sense of what they called lo mexicano, the Mexican essence. These festivals would allow the Mexican government to exert some type of control over its people abroad in the United States and try to facilitate a specific form of patriotism. Now, when the Mexican president took over in 1920, Alvaro Obregón, he began to not only try to re-stabilize the country after the revolution, but he began to establish more Mexican consuls in the United States. And he began to use those consuls to sponsor lectures from Mexican speakers. He began to use the consuls to sponsor the 16 celebrations throughout the United States. Yes, in places like Texas, and New Mexico, and California, but also places like Chicago and Michigan. And this program was highly successful in promoting to reassert people's Mexicanness. And it was evident the Mexican consuls had direct involvement over the implementation and the carrying out of these festival programs. There was uniformity in how these Fiestas Patrias were celebrated throughout the country, whether you're in Michigan or California. The Spanish language newspapers played their part in this. They helped promote this nationalistic vision of lo mexicano in the United States by helping to promote this, by promoting these events, by detailing how to properly observe the Mexican Independence Day. The Mexican consuls themselves would use the Spanish language newspapers to promote that Mexican nationalism. For example, in 1920, the editors of La Prensa and El Heraldo would reprint a telegram from one consul, Eduardo Ruiz, that exhorted all Mexicans celebrating in the United States to always play the Mexican national anthem first. So the first thing you need to do when celebrating the Dia 16 is to play the Mexican national anthem. This was to validate their Mexicanness. But the editors of these newspapers not only reprinted the exhortation from the consul, but added to it that it was the Mexicanos in the United States, Mexican Americans, that it was their patriotic duty both to Mexico and to Mexicans abroad to properly print this article and to conduct these celebrations in this manner. In fact, 1922, El Heraldo would even publish the lyrics to the national anthem along with the actual score, so that bands that may be hired could play the national anthem properly. El Heraldo also urged Mexicanos to pay homage to los héroes que nos legaron patria y libertad, to the heroes who bequeathed us our country and our freedom. Again, to reinforce that Mexican sense of patriotism, pride in Mexican culture, in Mexican history. Starting in 1915, La Prensa in San Antonio ran a special edition newspaper every year to highlight and cover Mexican independence celebrations across the United States. That was part of its mission to, quote, express patriotic fervor for the homeland, unquote. And during the 1920s, I can tell you, I've read the newspapers. It would devote considerable space each September to lengthy descriptions of various festivals in a section called Ecos de las Fiestas Patrias, Echoes of the National Holidays. These reports would span 14 states, reinforcing a Mexican cultural belonging by attempting to unify U.S. Mexicanos with both Mexico and Mexican culture. Now, while the Spanish language press promoted and reported on the festivities, the true on-the-ground execution of Lo Mexicano was in the hands of local and state Mexican leadership, who would serve and reach into the local Mexicano colonias, these enclaves. Now, to implement this patriotic vision, the state Mexican councils in places like Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles, they would encourage patriotic organizations and mutualistas, mutual aid societies, to plan, organize, and host the fiestas with funding from both the organization and the councils themselves. Again, this was a very structured plan, using these Mexican holidays as a way to promote Mexicanness and to retain Mexican culture with Mexicanos in the United States, with funding from the councils themselves. Now, I mentioned mutualistas, mutual aid societies. So what are these mutualistas? Well, what they are is mutual aid societies. These are self-help groups. Now, one of their tasks was to help plan and host the Fiestas Patrias. But their most important task was being a mutual aid society. They provided Mexican Americans with crucial support, especially in the early 20th century when, as we've seen, progressive America is not helping them. Now, mutualistas are not unique to Mexican Americans. They resembled African American mutual aid societies. And these were created in the face of rampant discrimination, racial discrimination, and economic deprivation. These groups would endorse political ideas, but Above all, they emphasize cooperation, service, and protection. And you can see the laundry list of things they do on the screen. They provide things like economic protection, education, community service, and provided things like insurance, self-help, legal aid, healthcare, funeral benefits. In fact, sometimes they'd even help pay for, if you were a Mexican national, help pay to send your body back to Mexico after you die. Healthcare, I said that one. Safe spaces in the barrios. Community events like the Fiestas Patrias. And some were even trade unions to help fight against workplace discrimination. They even help collect money to send back to Mexico. For example, in 1920, there was an earthquake in Veracruz in Mexico, and U.S. Mexicanos began to gather money through the mutualistas to aid recovery in Mexico. In 1921, money was again collected by the mutualistas, this time to construct 2 schools in Dolores Hidalgo, Guanajuato. In 1928, they again collected money, this time to build a health clinic in San Antonio to help the Mexican-American community in San Antonio. Now, while these things would evolve and change during the 1920s and 1930s, it was clear that during the first decades of the 20th century, the so-called progressive era, but it was clear during these 2 decades that to achieve these so-called progressive ideals, Mexicanos often had to turn within to help themselves. So while the rest of America is turning to the government to make these big changes in the progressive era, Mexicanos found themselves having to turn into themselves to help themselves. They were still being viewed as outsiders by Anglo society. And unfortunately, with the Mexican Revolution and World War I during the 19-teens, things were only seemingly going to get worse. But that's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.